Hi, welcome. We'll give a few minutes for everyone to join now that the the panel has started. Thank you for joining us at perhaps 4:30 on a Friday afternoon. I know the timing of that FDA hearing wasn't perfect, but we're excited to be able to chat with you all today about what we heard. Thank you all very much for joining us today. My name is Betty Aldworth. I am a 15-year veteran of the drug policy reform movement, a person living with PTSD, and for 4 years, I have served as the Director of Communications here at MAPS. Today's discussion will focus on insights and takeaways from the FDA's hybrid public meeting on advancing treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder. We're hearing from a panel of experts who have dedicated their careers to advancing PTSD treatment through research, therapy, and advocacy. I'm very honored to have this panel with us today of luminaries, truly, in this space. If you do have a question for the panel, please do use the Q&A function in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. We'll address those questions during the open session at the end. You can also reach out to our colleagues in public relations at maps@kcsa.com. Somebody will drop that in the chat for any follow-up interviews with our panelists or other experts who have been working in this area. I want to note that the MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD drug development program has transitioned to Lykos Therapeutics. So neither MAPS nor our panelists have any additional details on the FDA's instructions to Lykos for the third phase 3 trial that they have asked for. So any comments about that made today should be viewed as personal opinion, not as representing Lykos Therapeutics, which we do not. I do, though, invite you to ask questions as appropriate for these experts, all of whom have experience that's related. I want to start by acknowledging something that was said by Dr. States from the HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services. During the FDA meeting, he said that communities, cities, and states are moving forward with public health initiatives, and there is a need for better coordination across these efforts. And I want us to think about that for a moment, because the delay in FDA approval is, of course, heartbreaking for many. It's also heartbreaking for the thousands of people who are still suffering from PTSD, who have reached out to us desperate for effective treatments. So despite support from 80 members of Congress, veterans groups, trauma experts, so many others, the FDA continues to delay or has delayed this approval. And yet, in the real world, many people are using psychedelics in unregulated settings today because they see them as their last chance to heal after they've tried everything else. States like Colorado and Oregon have already implemented regulated psychedelic treatment models, and we're hopeful that Massachusetts will follow in November, very hopeful, because the voters in those states, the people have decided it is time to move beyond the very restrictive and needfully restrictive in many cases, but the FDA process that is currently failing patients living with PTSD. Many of them, not all, but many. So MAPS is as committed as ever to working with people and communities across the US and globally to advance safe, legal access to these treatments in communities, in states, and we are going to be putting a lot of our energies in those kinds of efforts that are going to provide access regardless of what the FDA requires, because the reality today is that many people are accessing these treatments. Many people will continue to do so. And we must be there to help provide a container to help advise on building the container in which that is a legal and safe, a safer and legal, equitable opportunity for people to heal. So that's where we're putting our efforts. I would love to talk to any of you about that as we are moving into the next legislative session and into this election season, into some changes to our educational programs that will make our resources more accessible to communities. But for today, I know that you are very eager to hear from our renowned experts. So let me introduce to you first, oops, pardon, Dr. Michael Mithoefer, who with his wife and co-therapist Annie Mithoefer has been working on MDMA-assisted therapy research for 25 years. He has trained hundreds of people in the trial protocol that was used in the MDMA-assisted therapy trials, and is the lead author of the MDMA-assisted therapy treatment manual, as well as being an author on many of the papers about the research, the peer-reviewed papers about the research. We have with us today Bessel van der Kolk, perhaps one of the world's most well-renowned trauma experts, who literally wrote the book on it, The Body Keeps the Score. He's trained thousands of clinicians worldwide in trauma-focused therapies, including EMDR and neurofeedback. He founded the Trauma Research Foundation and has conducted extensive research on PTSD, developmental trauma, and the neurobiology of trauma. Dr. Dave Rabin is a psychiatrist and neuroscientist who has been researching the impact of chronic stress on mental health for over 15 years. Dr. Rabin has trained clinicians in the use of psychedelics for mental health treatment and has led studies on the therapeutic potentials of both MDMA and ketamine. And Dr. Darron Smith is a U.S. Army veteran, a clinician, scholar, researcher, and educator who seeks evidence-based solutions for people with mental illness. His research focuses on how systemic race-based discrimination affects healthcare outcomes, especially for communities of color. He also researches applied neuroscience and psychedelic research. So, Dr. Mithoefer, I know that you have to jump at the top of the hour. Thank you for joining us at this in this moment, but we'll start with you. One of the things that you noted today was a lot of discussion around existing treatments for PTSD, either drug treatments or psychotherapy treatments for PTSD, and the assertion made by a number of speakers that psychedelic assisted therapies should be compared to existing treatments in order to evaluate their efficacy. And can you talk a little bit about your impressions there?
Yeah, thank you, Betty. And I just want to say I appreciate a chance to talk about this because obviously I have my own biases. I've been working on this for almost 25 years. So it's critically important that we have a rigorous FDA process and we welcome knowledgeable input from other people. Unfortunately, what happened, I would say, at the advisory committee and in many communications since is people are making a lot of comments based on real misunderstanding of what the research was and what the therapy is. So it's very unfortunate to be espousing a lot of ideas based on a misunderstanding. So it's really important that we talk to people who understand how the therapy was. So yeah, I think the meeting today went better than the advisory committee, I would say, in terms of understanding and being grounded in reality. But I think, one thing I did observe is I think many people in the beginning tended to overstate the effectiveness of existing therapies, though they all admitted we need more therapy. The reason I started doing research was because I'm a clinician and I was forced to do research because the treatments for PTSD were so woefully lacking. So I think, I've forgotten the person's name, the M, but he mentioned that with existing treatments, I think 12 to 20% or something lose the diagnosis. So that's still bulk of the people not losing the diagnosis. In the MAPS, in the Lycos phase 3 data and the phase 2 data, it's in the neighborhood of 2/3 of the people. So it would be a huge leap in effectiveness that is severely needed if these treatments can get approved.
And is it normal for FDA evaluations of new drug applications to include a comparison to existing treatments?
No, that's another interesting thing that's been coming up recently. The FDA process doesn't require demonstrating superiority to existing treatments. It requires superiority to placebo and safety, or placebo to the comparison to whatever control is. So it doesn't really fit. Yes, it would be good to do studies to compare with other treatments, obviously, but drug approval normally does not wait for that, because if a treatment is shown to be safe and effective, people ought to be able to access it at that point.
I'm no biostatistician. Apparently can't even say the word. And I'm you know, essentially a well-educated or well-versed layperson who's looking at the available data. And it does seem to me that people perform as well in the MDMA-assisted therapy trials with placebo as they do with some of those frontline treatments. So it's an interesting comparison that I think deserves some look by professionals who truly understand that data. So, you know, take that for what it's worth, which is very little, but this is what that is what I've noted. Yeah. Dr. van der Kolk, we'll turn to you. I'm curious, you have so much experience across various modalities and you know, many other treatment options. And what do you think about this question of we need to compare MDMA or psychedelic assisted therapies or MDMA assisted
Probably
therapies
have
to
studied more
others?
different modalities for PTSD than anybody else alive. I did the first study on Prozac, first study on Zoloft, first study on yoga, first study on EMDR. And because I'm always looking for how can you help people on what dimension? And we keep looking because some of these treatments are actually quite good, but there's always pieces missing. What is extraordinary about the MDMA is both how the PTSD scores went down, which, you know, anybody who really knows about psychiatry doesn't really respect DSM very much as a diagnostic system. But what really was stunning with MDMA is that the things that get in the way of people resolving their trauma got better. What gets in the way? People being terrified about their own feelings. And what you see on MDMA is that people go into these very dark places, and oftentimes they are very dark places. It's not like ecstasy that people are feeling great, but there is something about this drug that allows people to go back there by themselves and to go, oh my God, this is really what happened to me. But I was 3 years old, or I was 6 years old, and it wasn't my fault. And so a very gigantic part of what keeps people stuck in their PTSD is self-hatred, self-blame, and fear of their own feelings. MDMA, of all the things I've studied, and boy, have I studied stuff, was unique in allowing people to go like, yes, this happened to me, but it wasn't my fault. And I was just a little boy, or I was just an 80-year-old wild kid in Iraq who didn't know how to deal with his anger. And this issue of self-forgiveness was gigantic. Paxil, Prozac, all that stuff does not cause that. So from my mind, the most important finding of the study is not how you relate to your trauma, but how you relate to yourself. And that is really the marvel of these psychedelic agents. They're mind manifesting systems. Prozac is not a mind manifesting thing. You really get to know yourself and say, this really happened to me. And it allows people to go on with their life with a fresh perspective. They're not fun drugs. I think part of the reason why the FDA is against it is the terror that people might actually have a good time. Psychiatry is about bad stuff. The idea that people actually might feel good. oh my God, God forbid, that's for parties. That's not for psychiatry. In fact, sometimes people feel good. My personal experience with these drugs has never been all that pleasant. But boy, have I learned a lot about myself and my own stuff that caused me to become a trauma researcher. That's it. Yes, it really happened. And it's okay now. Nothing else that we have studied does that.
If I can add, Betty, to what Bessel said about it's not usually an easy process, several people in our study said afterwards, I don't know why they call this ecstasy.
I was one of them. But the interesting thing, I had to have my own session with Michael in order to become PI. And I was expecting, I'd never taken them stuff. And I thought, hey, this is going to be great. I lied there for 8 hours. And I'd always minimized the effect of vicarious trauma. People say, I've seen a lot of traumatists people. It didn't really get to me. On my MDMA, all my traumatist people came to visit me. And I lied there for 8 hours, go, oh, shit. Oh, fuck. And Michael tried to be as nice to me as I could be. It's great to have him there, because to go through that stuff by yourself, that's why the psychotherapy piece is so important. All of our subjects in our study said, I could have never have gone to these very dark places unless I had people there to hold me, because so much miserable stuff came up. But finally, under these conditions, you're able to go there and say, yes, it's happened, but it is over. And in order to get that perspective, you need to have an environment that really is there for you, that accompanies you on this very hard journey.
I've said that many of us have begun our healing journeys on the dance floor. But for those of us with more serious mental health conditions, we do most of that work in a therapy room, right? Then
Betty, I want to make sure that media people here understand that that experience Bessel's describing happened in an FDA and DEA approved clinical trial.
Of course.
Therapists.
That's right.
Experience.
On the up and up. When you have a level 1 license, you don't mess around with it. Right. But the issue that you brought up earlier is, yes, now the FDA has disallowed it. This culture is alive and well. It will all go underground. And as it goes underground, we'll learn nothing. We can only learn and do research if it's legitimate. And the moment you make it illegitimate, we'll learn nothing. But it will continue to happen. So people say 13 million people a year take MDMA. We better learn something about what MDMA does by making it legal. You know?
I couldn't disagree with you about that.
Definitely agreed.
Yep, right.
Darron, on this line of limitations of existing frameworks, modalities, ways that we think about trauma and treatment and drugs in general, the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for PTSD, I'm so sorry if y'all can hear that incredibly loud blower. I hope that you can still hear me. Working from home is an interesting, oh good, you can't hear it, wonderful, okay. So the limitations of the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria really can contribute to the difficulty in evaluating the full impact of things like racial trauma, which I know you've done a lot of work around, and sort of generalized all-cause trauma within racialized communities. And then it also, those difficulties apply beyond to clinically measuring healing and transformation among those people who do respond to psychedelic assisted therapies, who are living with that sort of more generalized trauma. Can you talk about some of those limitations and what you think would be some constructive and generative answers for racialized communities?
Well, I think Bessel hit on it earlier, and he talked about it in his remarks. But yeah, the tools that are used to evaluate research, particularly that rely on the DSM-5, are highly, highly suspect. I mean, it's particularly when it comes to folks who are experiencing racial trauma. As you know, racial trauma is something that is not something that occurs in just a single event, but really is an accumulation of experiences of racial discrimination over the course of one's life. Right. And there might be a time when there's a tipping point, for instance, maybe something that occurred like maybe the the shooting of George Floyd, for instance, might be the catalyst that tips a person over into full-blown PTSD in terms of symptomatology. And particularly that's what the DSM is really trying to get at is symptom reduction or symptomatology related to issues, which are different from folks who are suffering from a race-based trauma. It's something that you can often see, but it's the microaggressions, the daily oppression that people face, just simply having more melanin in their skin. I heard some comments earlier regarding some of the symptoms of that are very similar to what people would experience with normal, just regular PTSD. More of a complex PTSD variety. I know Bessel knows a lot about this as well. And by the way, Brother Bessel, hope you don't mind me calling you Brother Bessel, but you and I have a colleague in common, Dr. Anat Rogel. I don't know if you know Anat, but Anat has talked about you and has wanted me to meet you for years. So it's nice to meet you and be with you finally. And so anyway, nevertheless, looking at some of the ways in which this manifests is very, very difficult for African Americans and other communities of color to be able to have a seat at the table using the current metrics for clinical research. And that's part of the problem. We have to throw out the old tools and bring in new tools, more holistic ways of evaluating people, much more in the nature of qualitative experiences. And so, and this is something that I don't think the FDA can really wrap their head around, in terms of what, or at least in terms of what this medicine does and how it affects people, much more the shifts in consciousness that occurs with these medications. And so in regards to African Americans and other communities of color and what can be done to sort of capture that group, and help. And this has been the biggest concern for me. In fact, I've reached out to one of our panelists on here, to talk about this, and he knows who he is, Dr. Michael. I reached out to Dr. Michael about a study that was going on in North Carolina. So it's interesting how the universe lays down tracks to put us in the same trajectory with people who I highly respect. So I'm kind of gigging out here a little bit, while at the same time trying to help the audience understand how these things are particular and very important. So community involvement and partnerships are very, very important if we want to build consistency with communities of color. Developing relationships with community leaders, organizations, targeting communities that need this work, this unique work, and valuing the things that they bring to the table. Training more culturally competent practitioners to do this work, to be sensitive to this work. That's been some of the criticisms that have been raised in some of the MAPS studies. There's just not enough people of color, to really generalize anything. And so that's something that needs to be mitigated. And also some of the tools that are used to evaluate efficacy and safety with patients in terms of participants in these studies. So, and some of this culturally competent training could include things that we don't think much about, which is implicit bias. I don't know if your audience or the media may know about the implicit bias test that Harvard has been doing for years. They have such a large N sample size. I can't even tell you what the sample size is, but it's highly predictive. And when you go in there and do a simple AIT, what one will uncover is that they have a high preference for white, right? And it doesn't mean that they discriminate or have any racial animus towards any group in particular, but rather that they've been socialized in a system that has been saturated with whiteness. And so, and when you do measure or look at communities of color in that same test, you see the same metric. That communities of color tend to have a high preference for white as well as white folks. So why is that? It's the socialization process. And so we have to kind of unlearn that. And unlearning it can be difficult because, as you know, particularly when we're talking about white Americans, because it's unlearning race-based trauma for white Americans is so painful and so difficult to get folks there. There's so many defenses that are up, making it almost impossible, which we need more allies to do so. I would also argue affordable and accessible services as well, reduce financial burden for communities of color. We need sliding scales. We need community-based funding and partnerships with organizations that are willing to subsidize the cost of these services. to make them more accessible to communities. We need more education and awareness, because in the African American community, for example, there is a complete stigma against any kind of drug. I think that has a lot to do with the war on drugs, which scared the hell out of the Black community, and so they don't want it. So, and that coupled with botched so-called pseudoscience to the early 19th century and 20th century into the 21st century, these atrocities continue. So African Americans and other communities of color are rightly concerned about these scientific, the work of science when it comes to their personal bodies and their personal concerns. Nevertheless, the need for those therapies, healing therapies, are evident in those communities as well. Finally, I'll say, because there's much more I can say about this, but there's traditional healing systems of worship and systems of practice and knowledge systems need to be incorporated into these practices. Hands down, we need to meet people where they are. We need to embrace their practices. We need to recognize that these are, for some communities, particularly our indigenous communities, where these medicines come from. They've been doing this a long time. I think we're kind of new to the game. So recognizing the value of these communities and what they bring to the table. And finally, I'll say this: policy and advocacy reform. We need to work with state organizations, marginalized communities, and other acolytes and representatives in the community and in this space to figure out a way to continue to advocate for these medicines as we need to. And I think as we can do that, we might be able to make some inroads. Look, the cat's out of the bag when it comes to these medicines. The cat's out of the bag when it comes to this treatment. And even as we are talking right now, there are millions of people, I would argue, throughout the world who are using these medicines in some form or fashion. It's time for us to embrace the great and recognize that these medicines have significant medicinal potential for curative health. And I would even argue in some situations, I've even heard the word cure, but I'll say that loosely.
Thank you. Bessel will give you just a moment to respond, and then we'll turn to Dr. Rabin.
Small bit about Darron. With the FDA's decision, these medicines are going to go underground. People like me have no trouble going underground because they're not afraid of getting arrested for drugs. Black people have a terrible history with drugs. Most Black people are not going to go underground to get this treatment. That means that basically the community of color, by this decision, has been excluded from, up to now, the most effective treatment for this condition up to now. It's a very big issue. I'd like to really underscore that, because the attitude about what the police will do to you is completely different from me than if you're a Black person. Number two, when I started this study, I told my colleagues at MAPS, you should study post-traumatic stress disorder, and you should not study people who have always been traumatized, including your population, but also people who grew up in violent and abusive homes, because those people have not responded well to our treatment, but they're all called PTSD because we have such a rough diagnostic system. So I put pressure on Michael and Rick. Exclude those people who have always had trauma, who don't have a memory of what life feels like. Okay, they overruled me, and I'm unbelievably grateful that it did, because that population that has never responded to any of our treatments in a predictable way of chronic abuse, chronic family violence, did extraordinarily well in this study. And that's what you should read in our scientific articles. One of what won the prize for one of the most important scientific articles of the year in the science. It is not lousy science. Read those articles and see what it did for people who had lifelong abuse, which had never responded to anything. And I think Darron's population fits in that category to some degree also.
I'm very eager to try to convince you all to come and do a talk with us on complex PTSD and racial trauma and the similarities and differences there. But we'll save that for another day.
Yeah, let me just chime in real quick. I was going to ask a question, because some of the things that we had talked about using psychedelic assisted therapy is one thing, but also Bessel, you can also speak to this as well. And also, I think one of our excuse me, I can't remember the name of our other panelists who's into neurofeedback, but I have used neurofeedback, and in fact, I was trained by ANOT, and I have seen some significant reduction in symptoms that we don't talk much about, in the scientific world and literature, even though there's over 2,000 publications on neurofeedback. We need to talk more about using that as a modality. There's many, many ways that we can get it. I think we can get PTSD that are probably, I would say, now I would know about comparable to what we have now, but what we have now is not working. So these other modalities have been scientifically studied and validated. So I would highly encourage folks to consider neurofeedback as a possible, treatment modality for complex PTSD.
We're going to turn to Dr. Rabin in a moment to speak exactly to that. But Michael, I think we have to bid you adieu.
Yeah, thanks, Betty. I'm sorry. It's our grandson's birthday party, so it's critically important.
Understood.
So otherwise,
Understood.
See you, Michael. Nice to see you. Nice to see you.
Good to see you, Darren. Good to see you, everybody. Take care.
All right, Dr. Rabin, it's queued up for you. Neurofeedback, neuroplasticity. You are doing work right now around the neurofeedback and neuroplasticity in combination or as a follow-up, a continuing care option for people who are going through psychedelic-assisted therapies or have been through them. Can you tell us a bit about your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm actually not. My work doesn't focus that much in neurofeedback, although it's a fascinating area that's an extension of my work. I mostly focus on biofeedback and haptic vibrational technology and sound and somatosensory experiences and how those impact psychedelic experiences and healing experiences without psychedelics. And the reason why the word neuroplasticity comes up here, and I completely agree with everything that Bessel was saying, in particular around learned trauma and fear responses, and how you can use MDMA therapy to extinguish them in people who have never ever seen treatment response before, like chronic PTSD, is just really fascinating and unique to MDMA therapy. And the reason why it's so interesting is because of, in large part, the neuroplasticity element of what's going on. So neuroplasticity is really our fancy neuroscience word for healing, or sorry, for learning new things. And it can be, we can learn more of the same things that we've learned before and strengthen existing neural networks in the brain, or we can learn new things and form new networks in the brain. And what's really interesting about psychedelic experiences, and what we now know from Eric Kandel's work, who is one of the most famous neuropsychiatrists, who won a Nobel Prize in 2000 for discovering how we learn and remember, is that what we practice, we get better at, no matter what it is. So if it's negative thoughts about ourselves, negative thoughts about how trauma changed the way we saw ourselves, or multiple traumatic events, or abuse, etc., or society influence, all of these things shift the way that we see ourselves. And if we keep going down those thought loop paths, we strengthen those neural networks. And so MDMA-assisted therapy is really interesting as and all psychedelic medicines in large part as neuroplasticity enhancement tools, because we have to feel safe to learn new things. And safety, and which is represented as vagal or parasympathetic tone in the autonomic nervous system, is responsible for all of our healing, all of our recovery, including digestion, immunity, reproduction, creativity, empathy, all of those introspection, looking inside yourself, interoception, feeling your body. All of those skills that we have access to in the healing process are only available to us when we feel safe enough to be able to learn new things. And if learning new things in and of itself, especially around negative emotional content or traumatic events, has been challenging for us before, and it's really, really hard to make a lot of headway quickly in regular psychotherapy. It can take years, decades to get to a significant difference started. And what we see with MDMA so fascinating is that it seems to be working molecularly to amplify certain safety regions in the emotional brain, the limbic system, that tell amygdala, our fear center, that it shouldn't be blasting off activity when there's no actual threat around, and thereby amplifying the safety of the therapy experience. It helps the client feel safe enough to remake meaning around their past traumatic events from a standpoint of it not being your fault and you doing the best you could at the time with what you knew, and gives you a framework to move on past it by learning from it and not judging yourself for it. And the safety really stuck out for us in our research as one of the most critical features of the mechanism of how MDMA therapy works, and that safety is critical to amplifying neuroplasticity and learning. So I think that tie it all together, the reason why this is so important is because when we talk about the FDA's criticism around safety concerns with MDMA therapy, it's quite unfounded in the science. If you look at the science around MDMA-assisted therapy, not only is MDMA itself safer than many other medications when using that are currently prescribed in mental health when used according to protocol, but there are almost no long-term side effects, if any, from in almost all the subjects that went through the MDMA-assisted protocol, and the entire therapeutic protocol is founded around safety, which in large part I learned from you, Michael Mithoefer. So thanks for training me in all of that.
Of course. I started talking while I was muted. We have an opportunity. We've got just a handful of minutes, so if anybody wants to pop a question into the Q&A, please do so now.
Can I add one thing real quick before we move on? So I think one thing that's really important to take into account, because many people do not remember the history of medicine and how many similar challenges we faced as a field along the way to get to where we are today. And I think it's really important to think about where does MDMA and psychedelic assisted therapy fit in the overall framework of the history of medicine. And if you really look at that, what it's most similar to is the discovery of two of the most impactful discoveries ever made in the entire history of medicine, which are, number one, hand washing in the 1890s, which nobody believed to be effective and wasn't implemented for 25 years later, and saved countless lives. Very, very simple, of course. And then the second one was antibiotics, discovered synthesized for the first time by Alexander Fleming with bread mold derived penicillin in 1928 or something like that. And so, at those times, infection, which was thought to be an incurable illness, like as PTSD is thought of today, that people will live with for life, was transformed into something that was curable or treatable in large part within 1 to 12 weeks of antibiotic treatment. And so by implementing these simple changes, we were able to see a transition of an entire pathology of mental health or of health infection, which is a terminal illness, or you're going to lose your life or your limb, to something that is now treatable within 7 days to 12 weeks. And that's what we're looking at with MDMA therapy. MDMA therapy for PTSD today, what the studies are showing, and with the long-term benefits that people are getting from it, is analogous to antibiotics for infection discovered in 1928. It's that big of a discovery for the field of mental health, and it revolutionizes the entire field and how we move forward and think about getting to the root cause. So I think taking that away is really important, just to think about the gravity of this discovery and that it will come through eventually. There's always resistance to me.
Can I supplement what you're saying? So what the FDA committee originally said, that the risks outweigh the benefits. They obviously did not read our papers that were published in the most prestigious scientific journals, because this is not a treatment study primarily. This is primarily side effect studies. I've done 50 years of studies. This was the most pain in the ass study I've ever done, because we looked at every conceivable side effects in over 200 people, and we found no side effects. And the FDA says you should do another study to study side effects. But that's what the study concentrated on. We did not concentrate on all the subtlety that Darron and I were talking about, all the complex issue of guilt and shame and embarrassment and hating yourself. We barely mentioned that. I happen to have a paper that actually wrote about it in the secondary data, but we did not focus on that. We focused on side effects. And if you come to the conclusion that this outweigh the benefits, you have not met the science.
I think it's yet another indication that the complexities of mental health care the complexities of our minds are very poorly addressed in the systems that we have available to us, right? For things like FDA approval or adoption of treatments, and the importance that we allow those systems to, or push those systems to start to adopt a higher degree of complexity as they're considering these things. So thank you. I think that's an important piece. All right. Well, any final thoughts from our esteemed experts, Dr. Kolk, Dr. Smith, Dr. Rabin? Anything else that you would like to share while we have really, truly I think almost all of the most prolific beat reporters on psychedelics here with us today. So we have not received any reporter questions. So we are at
what more do you
quarter
want?
after. But if we want to hang out for a few more minutes and give folks a chance to pop their questions in, happy to do that. But I do know that we had said that we would stop at quarter after, and or that we would run until quarter after, but I'm sure that no one's going to complain if you would like to stick around and answer some more questions while we have you.
You also can be in touch with us. Trauma Research Foundation in my case, or besselvanderkolk.com. I'm always happy to talk, because eventually the journalists will determine how this is being received. You are more powerful than we were as scientists, because you either pay attention to science or you ignore it. So you're the most important people here. Yeah.
Totally agree.
And of course, you can reach any of these panelists as well as many other experts, again, by messaging us at maps@kcsa.com, and somebody will drop that back into the chat again. And we will, let's see, I guess the question is, two questions that we can end on. What do you think is the next, what do you think is next that we'll be seeing from FDA? If you have any guesses as to that, how do you think this might, or the ultimate impact on psychedelic assisted therapy trials for drug development or approval? What do you think the net impact might be here? And are we going to improve this? Is this decision and the dialogue that's been happening around it improving our understanding or worsening our understanding?
Doing another side effect study would be an utter waste of time, and I don't know who the hell would do it. I wouldn't do it.
Agreed. It's been done.
With the money to do a worthless study. No, I think the next step actually is for the FDA to get overruled by state law, like they did in Oregon and Washington. I think you guys are a little bit too optimistic about Massachusetts. That has not been passed. I'm not sure if it will, but I think this needs to go to the citizenry and have people actually themselves, because the FDA panel was so completely scientific out of lunch. Nobody seemed to have known anything about either psychedelics or trauma who made these decisions. And so I wouldn't face them directly. It's like doing cognitive behavioral treatment with the FDA, I don't think will work.
That's already happening in terms of state legislatures are already hopping on board. California, of course, Colorado just passed theirs. They're in business now. So this happening. So it needs to happen a little faster, but it's happening. I'm working in the North Carolina space, and we're trying to get some inroads there in North Carolina.
And you're from Utah, if I understand correctly, Dr. Smith, and the Utah State Legislature has passed a bill that we'll see how it ends up implemented. It relies on some items that aren't in place yet, but the Utah State Legislature, of all places, has passed a bill allowing for psychedelic assisted therapies there.
That's excellent. Given the Mormon Church runs the legislature, so that's pretty good. That's pretty excellent.
Yeah, it was very surprising to see that one.
So I'd like to hear from Bessel in terms of his work with neurofeedback and what you've seen in neurofeedback, because I think you're one of the most prolific advocates of it, and so I'd like to hear more.
I think I'm in Europe right now, and it's really bedtime. I think neurofeedback is another incredibly important subject. It's also one of the most underutilized things, which is fascinating. But I don't think that's the topic right now. I think the topic right now is psychedelics. And so I'll just stick on that and then go to bed.
We'll get you two
Okay, I'm to the
connected.
combination of the two, Bessel, the potential
No,
for the combination of the two. But maybe that's a later conversation. But
my dream is to get neurofeedback in every school in America, but that's another topic.
Yeah. No, our dream is to get psychedelic assisted therapy training in every medical school in America.
No,
So
there you go.
People need to be trained. These are not innocuous substances, and the context and setting is incredibly important. And people should be well trained, and it should be in a very good context, and don't mess around with psychedelics. Huh? It should be done carefully. Let's give everybody psychedelics. No, absolutely not.
No. I was saying psychedelic assisted therapy training in every medical school and social work school and places where we would be training practitioners.
Would love that, actually.
Yes. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to clarify. Okay. So we'll close out today just by saying, I have to give the disclaimer, of course, that no psychedelic assisted therapy is yet approved by the FDA. Psychedelics, just like any other treatment, do not work for anyone. And of course, if one chooses to engage in such practices, excuse me, I might have just said that no treatments work for anyone when I meant everyone. And if one does choose to use psychedelics or any other substances, that they should be well educated about the harm reduction and ways to mitigate the risks. And with that, thank you both so very much for joining us today. Great honor to sit with you and have a quick conversation. And again, to the members of the media who have joined us, please reach out. We are more than happy to put you in touch with any of the experts with whom we work. And as you can tell, they have a lot to say. So have a wonderful weekend, everyone, and goodbye.
Good night.
Yeah.